Yes,
Wade.
sir.
Here we
Pastor
are, sir.
Paul. Sir, how you
We are
doing?
at it again on this 26th day of February 2022.
22.
Mercy. There's just two of us though today, man. I'm missing somebody. What's going
Yeah.
on?
Our co-host is in the midst of traveling and somewhere, I shouldn't even talk because, I'm still here
Yeah, you
and
look
I'm
like you're in a
traveling
hotel
too. So
room as it is yourself.
I'm in the hotel room. We're in the northern parts of our conference, Louisville, Kentucky,
All right
this
now.
weekend. So I'm still fulfilling my duties on the conference side, but I wanted to make sure I was here for Pastors Roundtable.
Home of Cassius Clay in Louisville, Kentucky.
Cassius
All right.
Clay, yeah. So our co-host is in the midst of something. He couldn't get on. He sends his regrets. He's called me. He has texted. He's reached out to you. He wishes he could be here, but he wanted me to let everybody know that he's sorry he couldn't be here, but he loves you and he looks forward to seeing you on next week.
Yes, indeed. And there's something that we would normally have him do right about this moment, and that is, Roger, I'm
That
gonna let you
is to
take up.
share.
There you go.
To let you know, you need to share and like. If you're on the YouTube platform, make sure you like it. You hit the bell. You do everything that you have there. If you're on the Facebook platform, make sure you hit share, and you know what? Hit share one more time. Share it to
One more
far and
time.
wide to all that you can connect with. Everyone, a page, a group, a person. Let everybody know that PRT is live right now. And Pastor Paul, we have a special group that has joined us this year. That we are actually streaming to their platform. What group is that?
That is none other than the Great Southeastern Conference. We are excited to have Southeastern in the house today. We are streaming to SEC TV. That is Southeastern Conference's YouTube channel, also on their Facebook page. So we want to welcome our Southeastern Conference family as well to the Pastors Roundtable today. Always a joy and a privilege and an honor to have Southeastern with us. And if you are part of the Southeastern family and you're watching on one of those platforms, we want you to just put something in the chat. We want to know that you are present and in the house today. And so we are excited about that. So Raj, I got to ask, when do we get to join the South Central as the communications director?
Listen, we can join them anytime you're ready. But we've always been there. We've always shared our stream to the South Central platform. So it's a norm, but we can make the adjustment to make it easier for us. So that's not a problem at all. I want to say a shout out to Jennifer Sharon. I was able to see her in person. She's one of our regulars here at Pastors Roundtable. And so we were together last weekend. We had town hall meeting there in Chattanooga, and I was able to be there in person. So I saw her, was able to pound the flesh a little bit. And so we're so good to see her again today online.
All right. Always good to see Sister Spade Davis representing, what is that? That's
Texas,
Southwest
North
region.
Texas, Northwest.
Yes. All right.
Northwest Texas.
So again, if you're joining us today, we want to know that you're here and where you're joining us from. So if you just put that in there today, we are grateful to have you as a part of our audience today. If you missed last week, Roger, what did they miss? If they were not with us last week, what did they miss out on last week's edition of the PRT?
Well, listen, all month we've been celebrating Black History Month. And so last week we talked about community engagement, the Black church, the history of the Black church and community engagement. Dr. Whitney Phipps, and Pastor Dariel Hoy. Oh my goodness. Did they drop some good stuff on us, inspiring things that helped us to see where the church has been and where the church is right now, and even shared some ideas of where we need to be. So we give God grace for the opportunity to have that conversation on last week.
Good stuff. You know, back in the old days, the evangelists would say, look, if you missed it, you just missed it. Sorry, you should have been here. But grateful today for technology, where if you missed it last week, you don't have to just miss it. You can go back to Pastors Roundtable YouTube channel, find last week's edition. You can dip in on that conversation. Powerful, powerful stuff as we looked at the history of the Black church in the community. Which brings us to today. I'm excited to get in today. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time.
But listen, before we jump there, I just want to make sure that we are culturally. I know that we are culturally correct in terms of, listen, we want to take this opportunity at the top of our program to let you know we here at Pastors Roundtable are heartbroken about the news that are happening to our brothers and sisters there in the Ukraine. It's just, we can't even begin to describe how we are feeling, but just to know what they're going through right now. And we're not just talking about Seventh-day Adventists or believers. We're just talking about everyone who lives, the citizens, the residents of the Ukraine country. We just want you to know our prayers are with you. We're praying that God steps in and does something miraculous, and he gains the glory of what is happening.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, listen, I am excited about today's program, about this discussion and conversation today. This was one of the most requested repeats that we have had at the PRT, and that was, drum roll. Go ahead, Doc, take it away.
Woo! Well, you listen. About a year, 2 seasons ago, we had with us the Slave Food Project. And it was just intriguing to talk about the Slave Food Project and what they were doing, what their ministry was. And so we asked them to come back and to share with us some of the things they are doing now and give us a little bit of update and maybe some new insights as to how we can have this love affair with this particular thing we call food and make it healthy for us. So we're just glad to have with us doctors Columbus, Baptiste, and Doctors Eric Walsh back with us from the Slave Food Project.
All right, let's bring them on. Here they are, none other than my wife finally calls the docs. Man, you guys, I just want to say this. I got to say this up front. I got to give a shout out for my wife. Since you guys were on the first time, she cannot get away from watching your productions of the Slave Food Project. And just what a ministry you guys have, just totally engrossing, informational, motivational, all of that. And we just want to really let you guys know we appreciate in my household what you guys are bringing to the table in this discussion on health and on healthy living. And really, and I'm gonna leap, and I don't know if it's I know Eric's gonna say it's not a big leap, but this is a social justice issue as well. And we're in the midst of Black History Month. Just what a unique way it is to really look at social justice and Black history in a very positive way. So thank you, gentlemen, so much for what you've done. We're going to give you guys just a minute and a second after we have a word of prayer to greet the audience. We are excited about you guys being here. So just after Pastor Wade gives us a opening word of prayer, we're going to turn it over to you guys and just give you a couple seconds here to say hello to the audience.
Let's pray. Father, we thank you for this day. We thank you for this opportunity. Thank you for our guests joining us. And we thank you for our viewers who have joined us also. We pray, Lord, that this conversation will be fruitful and will be palatable for us to make decisions for our lives, for our betterment of our lives. We pray this prayer in Jesus' name. Amen.
Hey, look, before they get started, I'm gonna say this one more time. If you know somebody's supposed to be here, y'all better get them. This is gonna be good today. So tag somebody, copy the link to somebody, get them in. Dr. Baptiste, let's start with you, man. We'll give you the time just to say hello to anybody, everybody you want to tell us where you are, what you're doing, what's going on with you since we've seen you last. The time is yours, sir.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here again. Thank you, pastors, for having us back on, and to the virtual congregation out there. You know, it's appreciated. And to Sister Paul, we appreciate your support. I'll tell you, the words of affirmation, they never fail to encourage us. So it's very encouraging to hear words of affirmation that our efforts are not falling on deaf ears. But I'll tell you, what we're doing is a work that's necessary. And it's a work that is an additional arm to what you all are doing. because you cannot achieve the spiritual wellness in absence of physical wellness. And so what we're trying to do is to educate the community and to really be an agents of change. And so we're steady on that course, we're steady on that path, and we're doing it every which way we can and through whatever media and whatever forum that opens itself up to us. So continue to pray for us, pray for our ministry as we go down this road and this journey and trying to convey information that is much, much, much needed to end the thing called health disparities inside of our community.
Mercy.
Thank you.
All right. Good stuff. Good stuff. Dr. Walsh, my friend. Good to see you, man.
Yes. Good to see you as well. Great to be back. For me, I mean, we talk a lot about stress at Slave Food. And even looking at the global events right now, it's a time of stress again. It's Matthew 24, 7 jumping out at you. And these are times where people can get very stressed. And stress does a lot of things. Shortens telomeres, which is a sign that you're shortening your life. Put you in a state of fight or flight. But part of our message is that Adventist health message. And one of the pillars of the laws of health is to trust in God. And so part of our health message really does sit in that. And there are many people who are sick because they don't know to trust in God. Matthew 24 and verse 8 says, all these are the beginning of sorrows. So as we talk today, I mean, we really have to talk about the fact that our health message is an anti-stress, anti-inflammation message in a time when the world is going to be quite stressful and chaotic. Wow. And so, what we are hoping to, as we share today, especially from the Black experience, this message is more needed now probably than ever. And so, what we are hoping to, as we share.
Awesome.
All right.
Well, listen, let's jump right in. I'm just waiting to glean some nuggets I could hold on to. When you were last here, you truly took the scales off of my eyes. But within the last couple of months, we're beginning to go back out. Options are being opened up in terms of food and stuff like that. But yet still, we have recognized that there has been this is a word I never used in the same sentence with food, weaponization. Can you explain the concept of weaponization of food and also then describe what your title is about this? You're part of the Slave Food Project. Share the weaponization of food, and then we want to talk a little bit about what is slave food. And we're gonna open it up to Pastor Baptiste, Dr. Baptiste first.
Okay, and actually, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna let Eric kick it off with Dr. Walsh kick it off with weaponization of food, and then I'll chime in with slave food.
All right.
So the weaponization of food, actually, this is a good time to talk about it. What we found during the pandemic is that there was an increase in comfort food consumption, fast food consumption. In fact, some unhealthy foods are actually resurrected from olden days and brought back to market. The weaponization of food speaks to a lot of things, and one of them is using food to control people and using food to actually injure people. And it ties into the slave food side of it. When our ancestors were slaves, food was one of the ways that you could actually control the slave, right? They had to work for their food, and you didn't have to give them the best quality food. And so food was weaponized. It was used to break a person's spirit and to control an individual. And that's something that we see still to this day. The modern food and drug industries, especially the food industries we're talking about now, have figured out a way to use food to get us to continually go back and buy. That's why they say once you pop, you can't stop, but you can't eat just one. And so food has been weaponized through the combination of salt, sugar, and fat, through food engineers, food chemists, to make it so that you can't put the food down. And that is weaponized food, especially when you know the food is making people sick, costing them their livelihood, and ultimately costing them their lives.
Wow.
Yeah, it's deep when you look at the concept of weaponization of food, and it transitions immediately into the Slave Food Project. But as you really consider the concept of weaponization of food, that many of these food producers, these manufacturers, they characterize consumers as users and they want frequent users of food, right? And so as they begin to actually test out the exact levels of sugar and of salt according to your gender, according to your age, according to your ethnicity, to figure out precisely the amount that's going to attract you. And that's why many of us, we observe this in everyday fashion, that we go into certain neighborhoods, into grocery stores, and there's certain items that are not available in other grocery stores because of the fact that there's an understanding of what we're trying to feed certain groups of individuals based upon sales. The business of business is business. And so when we look at the weaponization of food, it dovetails into slave food, which is the manipulation of nutrition for profit and for power. It's the manipulation of nutrition to figure out how I can make the biggest amount of money, the largest assets that I want to go ahead and glean. And that's really what it's about. And so when we came together, Dr. Walsh and myself came together, we were really looking to figure out this interplay between stress, this unique form of stressor called discriminatory stress, and the additional level of nutritional stress in the formation of health disparities, because we were seeing this continual onslaught in this widening gap that became ever present during the pandemic, right? We all saw it, but this ever present widening gap of health disparities that became that continues every single day. And that's what we're dealing with during this month of Heart Health Month and Black History Month in reflection.
Wow. Hey,
wow. As you were sharing there, 1 minute, Dr. Paul, as you were sharing there, it just clicked now. It makes sense. I just this week, my wife and I, we were talking about what we wanted to eat. She wanted to cook some homemade soup. So she sent me to the store and she sent me with the list: green banana, yam, some corn. And when I went to the local grocery store, they didn't have any green bananas. They didn't have any yam. I wouldn't call the name of the big W store that we shop at. And it makes sense. In certain neighborhoods, you don't have what you really need in order to have that. So, wow. Thank you so much for sharing that today. Dr. Paul?
I could hear Dr. Walsh thought he was saying starch.
Well, no, those are good starches.
Yeah.
And that's part of the problem.
Go.
And there was a question that came in through the chat. Can people really be addicted to carbs? The problem is that our society has oversimplified carbohydrates. And what you have to understand is that carbohydrates are perfectly fine until they're processed and the fiber stripped away from them. So my parents are Jamaican, so we eat yam and chocho and dashin and sweet potato and all that kind of stuff. Those are, and green bananas. Those are they have soluble fibers, insoluble fibers, very good to feed the gut bacteria, and it's what our African ancestors ate before they were enslaved. So they were very good. They're very good foods. Carbohydrates become addicting when you strip the fiber from them, and what you're left with is sugar, really. A combination of fructose and sucrose, which is very simple, and they're very addicting. And so there's studies, in some of our slides, we show you pictures of MRI scans of the brain of someone who's a chronic sugar user next to someone who's a chronic cocaine user, and they both look very similar because it messes with the dopaminergic pathway parts of the brain, like the substantia nigra. And so you change the brain and how it responds to pleasure when you eat lots of sugar. So yes, the studies pretty much kind of reinforce sugar is addicting. The chemical structure of sugar is actually very similar to alcohol. And its effects on the liver are very similar to alcohol. So those carbs are addicting. When you eat whole sweet potatoes, brown rice, quinoa, with the fiber, it's a very different food, releases the sugars from it very slowly, and feeds your gut microbiome, the bacteria that live in your gut. We'll talk more about it as we go through this. So those foods are actually quite healthy, but the simple processed stuff we buy in the store, the boxes of macaroni and cheese, the spaghetti, the white rice, the white bread, there is no nutritional value to most of that stuff. It just becomes sugar once you digest it.
Wow. Yeah, well, listen, Dr. Baptiste, I wanted to kind of circle back to a comment or a reference that you made about the impact of the pandemic and how that has, I don't remember exactly, you said has brought to light some inequities or some disparities, but could you guys just speak to that very quickly? What did we see during the pandemic that spoke to some disparities or some inequities in terms of health and food, et cetera?
I'll tell you, what we saw during the pandemic is all we saw is that the closet door was swung open. The bed sheets were moved up so we could see what was swept underneath the bed. And that has always been present there since as long as African people of African descent have been on this continent. And we have seen the stark health disparities that have existed as long as we've existed throughout the slavery era, throughout the 20th, early 20th century, and persist into now, as long as we've collected data. And so we've seen that African Americans are more likely across the board to have high blood pressure. You're more likely to have diabetes, twice as likely to have diabetes. And diabetes happens about every 17 seconds. The new person is diagnosed with diabetes. We're more likely to die from cancers. We're more likely to have heart disease at a young age. And by middle age, over 50% of people of African descent have heart disease. But here's the catch. You're less likely to receive treatments for it. That when we review the medical literature in general, that despite having the disparities of having the highest risk and burden of chronic disease, many people of African descent were less likely to receive procedures that are required. They're less likely to be referred, even for what I do, interventional procedures in the throes of a heart attack, being referred for advanced procedures. And so these disparities became stark. And it began the process of uncovering why exactly do they persist. And that's where there's subtly have begun, this process has started, where we've started to look at this idea of social determinants of health, where you live, where you work, where you play, where you pray, and trying to figure out what is the confluence of issues that are playing a role in this thing called health disparities.
Wow.
And I would jump in and say one of the things that the pandemic really did a good job of, as Columbus said, I mean, swung the closet door open. It also functioned as an accelerator. It was like you poured fuel on a fire. So Black people already had significant health disparities and health problems, and when you added in this pandemic, and this virus was a unique virus in that it's very pro-inflammatory, and so you're gonna hear me talk about that a lot today. And because stress is also pro-inflammatory, and the standard American diet, the SAD diet, is also pro-inflammatory. If you were someone who was stressed, eating the standard American diet and got this virus, especially early on in the first year and a half, up until probably about last November, you were going to get pretty sick, especially if you weren't immunized. You were going to get very sick because your body was primed to get sick from this thing. And so lifestyle had a lot to do with it. We know vitamin D levels, we know sun exposure, and not direct sun exposure, even sun from the shade. All of these things had a lot to do with it. But the antioxidant effects of eating of a plant-based diet, fruits and vegetable rich diet, really was protective. And so you started to see all of these things, even the way that the primary receptor that the spike protein plugged into is in a dysregulated state in a lot of us. And that's the H2 inhibitor, the H2 receptors, which a lot of Black people actually take medicines to try and block that receptor. So the virus really worked to show things. It was like I said, like an accelerator. Then it exposed America's that's not so dark secret, and that is that there are significant health disparities driven by many factors that can be reversed if certain things are changed.
Wow. Well, I'm gonna throw in there. Sorry, Pastor. Too, as well, to follow up with what Eric mentioned, is that the unique fashion about 2020 and the pandemic is that we also were faced with the visual effect of the social outburst, right? Of the killing of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor. These things came to light. The recognition. So these stressors of either things we had individually gone through as unique individuals, or that we had heard stories passed along through the generations that raised the level of stress in our bodies. That study after study has shown the correlation between stress and disease, and racial discrimination is a form of a stressor. And that these things increase the inflammatory process in our body. That these stressors now, they heighten our attractiveness towards these foods, these highly processed foods that Eric mentioned. They act as an antidepressant, anxiolytic, but very short-lived. They're fake resources. We say stress equals demands minus resources. They're fake resources. They're fool's gold. And so we continue to go back for them over and over, thinking that it's solving our problem of absence of resources, when all it's doing is inflaming the process of disease inside of us. So now we, as people of African descent, we're in the front lines. Not only front lines as front worker, as essential workers, not only front line in terms of the environments that we live in, but front line now as we're faced with this stressor in the midst of this viral storm that hit us.
Wow.
Yeah. So one of the things that you're sharing there has me thinking. It's the information is simply, if I were to break it down into the basic building blocks, you talked about, Dr. Walsh, you talked about stress being a major culprit in the situation that we're in here. And when I hear it, I said, wow, if it's just stress, then I should be able to just get rid of stress and I should be fine. But it's more than that. Sometimes we get the education, but we tend not to want to believe it, or we tend not to really want to hear it, or what is it with us? And I'm speaking from one of the people groups, that we don't believe what we're hearing. Why is it so hard for us to accept what it is and make the changes to do better?
I'm gonna first answer that spiritually, since we're on a pastor show, and then I'll come back to the pathophysiology of it. One of my favorite Bible verses I learned in Cunningham Hall at Oakwood University when I was a freshman, and a gentleman from California, Nelson, sat us down and showed us Romans chapter 7. I'd never studied Romans chapter 7 in church before, and what Romans chapter 7 says is, "The good that I would, I do not. And that which I would not, that I do." Then the verse says, "O wretched man that I am, who shall deliver me from the body of this death?" Now, Dr. James Kyle, some of you all would know, great preacher and physician out on the West Coast, good friend of all of ours, I'm sure. I love him to death. He came to our church at Rubidoux years ago and did a health and temperance day, and he said something that has stuck with me. I use it all the time, and I always give him credit for it. He said, if you listen to your body will conspire to kill you.
Mercy.
Wow. Your body will conspire to kill you. And then I went and did a study once on the flesh. What does the Bible say about trusting the flesh? Do not lean on the arm of the flesh. Over and over, it warns you that your body cannot be trusted. Wow. Because we have propensities and desires that are antithetical to our own good. Right? Adam ate the fruit from Eve, even though he knew the consequences. Cain did what he did to Abel, despite knowing the I could go all the way through the scripture. Right? So when it comes to us, and something that Dr. Baptiste just said, we eat these foods because stress is something that you want to self-medicate against. So what happens is your body says, I need, make me feel better. And so stress actually triggers your desire for comfort foods. The comfort foods feel better. But the studies that we show when we do our talks, laden with sugar, salt, and fat, but especially the combination of sugar and fat. So them honey buns, right? Listen, the bun and cheese for the West Indians out there. When you combine the fat with the sugar, like you do with most baked goods, it feels good. It releases dopamine in the brain. You get a reprieve. But as was just mentioned, it is a fake resource. That is the spiritual side of it. Because in a sense, this is why Paul says your God is your belly, right? Because there are more receptors around that are involved in depression and anxiety in our digestive tract than in our brain. That's why you feel things gutturally. There's a great book I read on that. Gutturally, you feel things. So when you eat this food and you stimulate the GI tract, it's like your second brain. It now tells your body everything's all right because we got the fix. But you didn't really solve the problem. Stress is dangerous in a pandemic because when you're stressed, you release cortisol. Cortisol is the hormone that secondarily also regulates the inflammatory response of your immune system. If you are chronically high cortisol level, what happens after a while is you actually turn off the ability for your immune system to regulate overreacting and becoming inflammatory. That's what stress does. right? So
Wow.
in a pandemic with a virus that creates inflammation, stress became even more dangerous. And then, as Columbus said, think about what happened. All of the police-involved violence. And we talk about the police-involved violence. We seldom talk about the actual rise in violence, period, in our neighborhoods.
Yeah.
Right? There's been
Yeah.
a wave of killings in our neighborhoods, and then them throw in the global stuff like what happened in the Ukraine. So physiologically, you get to a place where you really want these foods, and even when you know better, it's difficult to turn away. Why? Because in essence, that is the definition of addiction. Something you do despite knowing its consequences.
Wow.
So it's not that people don't know. It's Romans chapter 7.
Mercy.
My goodness. Woo.
Yeah. Well, listen, we hit some. I see a couple of questions here from our audience that I want to let you guys take a chance to address. First one is coming from Miss McKenna's classroom, and she's asking, how do I get this up here? She's asking, how about genetically modified plant-based food? Has that been discussed yet in the context of stress and inflammation? And then she follows that up with, she's asking because I planted a grape tomato, didn't bury it completely, checked it for more than 2 months, and it had remained in the same state. Some 5 months later, it has begun to shrivel. Any thoughts on plant-based, genetically modified foods?
Well, I don't know if I'm not a botanist, so it'd be difficult for me to jump in and answer this fully, except to say that we avoid genetically modified things. I think until the science is in better, we encourage people to eat organic foods if at all possible. Grow your own food, so you can buy the seeds and grow it yourself. Is one of the things that I would honestly say. So, it's easy to, I thought you were going to ask more about the plant-based meat substitutes. Because some of them, you got to make sure you're not eating too much of the soy protein isolate that's in them, because they are, you can overdo the protein from that perspective. And I'll let Dr. Baptiste jump in on that. But that's one of the things that I would really be worried about more so.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, I'll jump in there. And what I'll say about the genetically modified foods, like Eric mentioned, is the fact that there's so much that we don't know. I think that's the fear and the concern generally, that as we begin to splice and we're doing different things to kind of create essentially resistant fruits and vegetables, right? Resistant to insects so they can have staying power. And as we begin to manipulate their processes, we may extract out. Now, some of this manipulation is not for, it's for our own appealment, like for the eye visually. Take the tomato, for instance, that modifications have been made so it's bright red and it's large, right? But we know that the more colorful, right? Not even to go down the road of saying the darker the berry, the sweeter the juice, but the more color and reflection that is contained within fruits and vegetables, we know that that is rich in the power and the source for antioxidants, that there's huge benefits that are there. So as we begin this process, as man oftentimes does, we try to manipulate things. We try to tinker with it, that it results in ill effects long term. And this is what has played out since the dawn of time. So that's part of the reason why I personally try not to ingest genetically modified ingredients as much as possible until we glean more information, like Eric mentioned.
All right. Well, listen, we had a section a little while ago to segue to the next question, and we ran past it, and I'm going to kind of bring us back to it. So when we're talking about, and particularly with this being Black History Month, when we talk about the weaponization of food, what role, if any, has racism played in that process, the weaponizing food? And what role has racism played in the creation of health disparities within society? Is that something that is just natural, that is genetic, or has there been some intentionality behind some of the disparities that we've talked about before?
Columbus, you want to go first?
That's a loaded one. That's a loaded question. So, You know what I'll do is I'll start in, but we'll kind of tag team because this is a lot of information here that needs to get out to the audience and so forth. When we look at the weaponization of food, and as far as its intent, has there been any intentionality as it relates to it? I think you have to take a few steps back, even beyond the food, and you're looking really so at how racism has played a role in terms of neighborhoods, played a role in terms of opportunities. And so as you begin to take a step back and you look after the Great Migration, and you see where folks were fleeing the South and moving to areas of Chicago and California and New York and various places like that, how they were comprised inside of areas that did not afford them the opportunity to have patches of land to grow, that they had to kind of cook real fast out of little central kitchen areas, that as a result, African Americans became early adopters of fast food.
Wow.
As you begin the process of looking, and even from a cultural standpoint, being unable to enter in through the front door, of having to get your food from the side or the back or going through like a drive-through, that all of these things began to become ingrained. Then as cities began to happen, what ended up happening, right? There was redlining, that there was partitioning of where you had the opportunity to live, unincorporated areas that were not funded by the government agencies for education or walkways or parks or things of that nature. So now we created this. Now I won't even say food deserts. I see that. I'd say food apartheid areas. That these are created.
Wow.
These were not natural occurrences. These were man-made occurrences that transcribed there. And so as you look at all of these factors now, that began to play, and where you had state highways that would intersect and bisect communities of color, dividing them, eliminating business opportunities for grocers and things of that nature there, and racism playing a role in the competition, that now you begin to squeeze out the ability to glean health promoting foods. Then as we came into our own during the civil rights era and began to receive equal rights, and riots came out, there was a statement, a great book kind of brought this out about how Richard Nixon, he said that any act of racism is an act of terrorism, an act of communism. Right. And so what did that mean?
Wow.
What did that mean overall? They started to go ahead and provide small business association loans to go ahead and rebuild the Black community. And so what came in there? Liquor stores, fast food companies started going inside of the neighborhoods. And what got squeezed out were fresh grocers that had a lower profit margin. So now we created these environments that are filled with food swamps. Foods that are filled with garbage. We talked about carbohydrates before. It's not carbohydrates that are a problem. It's garbage. It's garbage. A form of garbage is what's there. Not the stuff that you chew and your jaws get tired of rich carbohydrates like you guys talked about before. And so we get squeezed out. And so now we create these crucibles of conflict, of stress, of racism, and devoid of nutrients, nutritional stress. And we're surprised about the issues in terms of our health. So that's a brief look in terms of, is there a direct correlation? Yes. But at the end of the day, it's business of business is business.
Yeah. Listen, just
with intent.
For sake of,
oh, sorry, go ahead.
Just for sake of clarification, can you differentiate quickly the difference between a food desert and a food swamp? Because I've heard those terms recently in it.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead there. No, you got it.
I can quickly. A food desert is when there is not enough real food. In other words, whole foods, not enough. And I don't mean the store. I mean whole foods like broccoli, cauliflower. You go to the corner bodega store. You go to the corner store I used to go to at my grandmother's house. They had every type of candy, chips, soda, alcohol in the store, but you couldn't find nothing green. Unless it was painted green. So a food desert is where you can't get real food. But a food swamp is where you have calorie dense, nutritionally sparse foods. There's no nutrition. So let's give you an example. Plenty of Twinkies in the neighborhood.
Yeah.
Plenty of honey buns. Plenty of Oreos. Plenty of bags of potato chips, Takis, and Flamin' Hot Cheetos. That swamps are in neighborhoods while you can't find a cucumber or a head of lettuce, or an apple or a peach that is not rotten or thrown to the side. So that's how you define those two things. And to echo what Columbus just said, this is what the government has done. The government did this by as Richard Rothstein says in his book, The Color of Law. The government participated with the developers and the local town councils and city councils in order to create areas of towns that could not be integrated, excluding blacks, making the neighborhoods where black people live more expensive per capita than the neighborhoods where white people lived. And then, of course, no one would invest in those neighborhoods, because why would you invest in the neighborhoods that had the least amount of value, where people were living one on top of the other? Because that's how they had to survive. So there's two families that live in one apartment or more. So the bottom line is, there is an intentionality to what has happened that does bear the stain of racism. And let me give you two other examples. One of them is advertising. In our talks, we talk about how much more advertising is received by Black young people, Black children specifically, through television, radio, and back in the day for us, it was magazines and everything else that are targeted towards us. You go into Black neighborhoods, they promote the toys and the Happy Meals more than they do in other neighborhoods. And so they promote these foods to the tune of billions. I wish I had all the numbers up, to the tune of billions of dollars. And because our children watch more TV and they can predict what TV shows our children watch, these foods can be targeted towards our children. Now, you would say, well, the business of business is business. We always say that because that's one of our guests taught us that. But here's the truth of the matter. It is no longer simply business when you know the business is killing people, right? At that point, there's an ethical, moral component that comes into it, which is why the cigarette companies have to put a warning on a cigarette.
Right.
There should be a warning on some of these foods before they're sold to people, quite frankly. The other part of it, the other proof of it is the subsidies.
Well, they do actually have warnings in some of the fast food restaurants, a label when you go through the door or through the drive-through that says by eating here, you can get cancer, you can get diabetes and high blood pressure, and people continue to funnel through the line.
That's only in California,
wow.
That's only in Cali.
It's a California thing. Okay.
But the other part of it is the subsidies. If you grew up like I grew up, I mean, you had family members. We never got any government. My mother never got government cheese for whatever reason, but we had family members who did. And that block of government cheese, you know what it was? It was the rejected fat from the dairy industry that they couldn't do anything else with. That Ronald Reagan, we have a picture of him holding up a block of government cheese that he had them packaged, put together. It's basically salt, cholesterol, and animal saturated fat, literally poison. Going back to Sister White in the spirit of prophecy, she warns us over 100 years ago that cheese is not fit to be consumed as food. She says that before she even gives the advice to stop eating meat. She says you should stop eating cheese. The government took the garbage milk fat.
Wow.
I want you to get this. Packaged it, made the farmers more wealthy, and then took it and gave it away to welfare recipients, food stamp recipients, and showed it as if we were doing some great thing. Somebody had to know that there would be consequences to giving poor people, and this is not just poor Black people, poor Latinos. I was in Guam, they used to get it. Indian reservations got it. Giving them a food that would cause disease. And that's just one example. Let's talk about baby formula, right? All the decades of baby formula before WIC changed their ways, where we were giving women baby formula rather than having them nurse their children and give them the best possible nutrition. We could go on and on and on. And if you want to believe that somehow there's no connection to this and the way America views Black people, I think it would at worst be naive.
Wow.
At best be naive.
I was going to ask, when we first asked that question, is there, any intentionality or racism? I could see an argument where someone would say, sure, that might have been something that happened 80, 100 years ago where there was intentionality and racism and things, but do we see any of it now? But when you brought up that advertising piece, it's like that's advertising that's happening like right now. It's hard to argue that.
But not only in the advertising piece, you opened my eyes, because where I live in this certain part of Nashville, it's one of the suburbs, we have to drive almost 10 to 15 minutes before we can get to a grocery store. But getting to that grocery store, there are probably about 50,000 people living in that area, but there's no grocery store. There is nothing, because we built all these communities to help people to feel like we're moved out into the suburbs, but we have not. We have to drive far. Then people will make a decision. I don't need to go all the way over there to buy that food, so we'll stop at the local groceries, the local gas station, and pick something up there. You made it plain just now in terms of the choices we have made because of the circumstances we find ourselves, because we decided we want to move on up to the east side.
Yeah. Hey,
but you know what, Pastor? I mean, it's not even always about moving out to the east side, because I grew up inside the city. I grew up in Compton. And so I remember as a kid, it didn't dawn on me at that time. I tell this a lot of times inside of our lectures. It's the fact I remember going with my dad for a drive, right, to the grocery store. And he would drive literally about 25 miles away to go to a grocery store. And I remember walking through those doors as a kid. I love going to the grocery stores because it seemed like I was in heaven. You had all these fruits lined up and grow in colors and everything all around, completely different than what I experienced right around the corner from my house, right? And so but the key is not everyone has that capacity, that ability to drive a distance, to go outside their territory, to purchase foods in an affordable fashion and so forth. So it's a major issue. And I want to make sure we don't forget about the other second part to your question about, do we see areas of racism in medicine too as well from a historical perspective? Definitely want to touch on that as well.
Sure. It's just a point, Roger. I can remember, and both of you as our guests, I was sent several years ago to pastor in South Georgia. And when I moved up there, I found a piece of property, found a house. My parents were retiring. So we found a place kind of way out in the country, 40-something acres of land. And as soon as we got out there, the first thing that my Trinidadian father did was get out there and start digging up some dirt and planting some stuff. And we planted cabbage and onions and corn and tomatoes and all kinds of stuff, lettuce and fruit trees, all this kind of stuff. We planted all of these things and we would grow them. But the interesting thing was the neighbors were doing the same thing. So when we finished growing our stuff and we had too much, we would just go over to the neighbors and say, here's some stuff. And then they would say, oh, well, we got some stuff too. And just in that area, just because we were out in the country and we had the ability to grow some of these things, that people were sharing, just being neighborly, sharing these things. And so it provided a great opportunity that sometimes we just don't get when we're in more, crowded spaces. So I was able to experience that firsthand.
Yeah, so you're going to speak to the issue about racism in medicine.
Well, I think it
in health, I should say.
Yeah, no, I think, well, first I have to say that it still exists. And so I'll share with you all a story just recent. So I took a loved one to the hospital recently who told me that they were experiencing chest pain. All right, so I'm a cardiologist. I'm an interventional cardiologist, which means my job is to stop heart attacks in their throes. So they told me that they were experiencing exertional chest pain with a while walking, and that the chest pain began to intensify and travel down their arm. And they called me out of fear that they were suffering a heart attack. I told them to call 911, but when I got there, they had sent 911 the ambulance away because they felt embarrassed. I personally drove them to the hospital, drove them to the emergency room. And so in that moment, to an emergency room where I personally had worked before at that hospital, I performed interventions on coronary arteries. And I watched how the Caucasian nurse minimized the symptoms of this female. Wow. I watched how they somehow seemed as if they questioned the integrity of whether or not they had a true intention. I watched how they did not bring them back immediately, which is a standard protocol. I watched how they did not deliver care in immediate fashion in 2022. And it tells me the fact that there is still a persistent issue that exists inside of our country. And studies have reflected this. In 2016, there was a study that showed that when looking at residents and medical students, that they felt that there was a significant difference between white individuals and Black individuals in their skin thickness based upon the color of their skin, the melanin, in 2016. That as you go back in the eons in time, we only think we reflect on the Tuskegee experiment, But the issues of atrocity began long before then, and they persist long after that. That we know that there have been issues where there's, whether it's drapetomania, where there's a sense that because slaves wanted to run away, that they must be insane. Because how could they want to run away from something so wonderful as the plantation? that as you begin the process and looking at the experiments, there was a person who I'm going to mispronounce his name, it escapes me, who basically had experiments of radiation placed on him as a child that left his skull receding from the trauma that was there. That over and over throughout the eons in time, we see that these things are persistent. It's nothing that just happened. And we wonder, why is there this concern that institutions have recognized that there is indeed the level of implicit bias in my own area of cardiology? I described to you the ER experience, but here's the thing from physicians. I oftentimes think I treat everyone the same, and my colleagues do as well, but studies don't bear it out. They show the fact that people of African descent within the field of cardiology, where this is Heart Health Month, right? That we're less likely to receive, as I mentioned before, angiograms. You're less likely to receive referrals to heart failure specialists and receive defibrillators, to receive transplants, to receive valve replacements, that you're less likely to have all of these therapies that are standard of care. Now, when you begin the process of saying, well, what's the difference when this group of individuals have the highest burden of disease, but yet they're less likely to receive the appropriate treatment? There is indeed a persistent level of implicit bias and racism. And we say implicit bias only because in some individuals, it's subconscious. They think they're doing the right thing, but they pass judgments. And so those judgments, they escape their consciousness, and they believe they're acting out of normal aspects there in terms of the care. So yes, racism still is ever present in our society.
Wow. And I really don't know. We did a topic on CRT, and we realized it was brought out that it's not that it's an implicit situation. There is an underlying sense that those are the norm. This is how things ought to be. And I kind of grew up thinking we need people who can question the things that we just take for granted. And we need to really start asking questions, and that's what's happening here today. I want to jump quickly to this question. Is there a solution? Is there an antithesis or an antidote to slave food, and where can we find that? Is there an answer to some of the problems we've been talking about?
Well, there absolutely is. We also talk about liberation nutrition, not just slave food. And the liberation nutrition has everything to do with going back to the original diet. For us, from a culture perspective, that means you go back to the diet before slavery, understanding that some of the foods you can't take with you. So, in other words, the meats that might have been eaten before, you want to get rid of those today, because there's really no healthy way to get them. I mean, the studies now come out and show that you can classify processed meats like salami, bacon, hot dogs as class A carcinogens, just like cigarettes, and even beef, pork, and some of the other red meats are probable carcinogens. They probably cause cancer. So we know that we can get out of this if we can go back to eating the way God told us to eat in Genesis chapter 1 and verse 29, the original diet before the flood. That reverses disease. In fact, we talk about telomeres in some of our talks. I did one for my company, nationally for our company this week. And I talked about, the only way, the study showed the only way you can actually lengthen your telomeres, which are the tips of the chromosome. So as they shorten, genetic chromosomes, as they shorten, it indicates that your life is being shortened in a sense. But you can only reverse that with a whole food plant-based diet. Exercise can slow it down or stop it. Sleep can slow it down or stop it, but it takes good food to reverse it. Makes sense, huh? That's why the tree of life is a tree of life, right? Because it is the fruit from the tree that will probably keep our telomeres always extended when we get to the New Jerusalem and the earth made new. So we know that there's an antidote. The antidote is in the scripture, if you really want to look. And so those are the things that we have to really begin to look at. And I want to say this about, we were talking about the racism in the healthcare system. If someone commented that healthcare racism is everywhere. Yeah, but we work in the healthcare system. That's why we're talking about it from the perspective of the healthcare system. But the part of the problem is our politicians, when they're running for office, they say we want universal health care. We want better health care. Everyone needs health care. You know what they never say? Everyone needs health. Everyone needs better health. Because to get better health would mean that the same politicians would have to cut ties with the dairy industry, the meat industry, the processed food industry, the alcohol. Somebody asked a question about alcohol. Hopefully we can get back to alcohol and marijuana in a minute. The alcohol industry, the tobacco industry, the firearm gun industry. I mean, the very politicians that want universal health care, many of them want some of the stuff or are backed by some of the stuff that puts people in the healthcare system in the first place. And that's on both sides of the aisle. And until that hypocrisy in America is done away with, and people go back to saying what is actually good for the people, it won't happen. And if you're waiting for the government to do it, you might wait forever. So you have to make a decision for yourself and for your family that you are going to go back and eat the way God designed for us to.
Wow.
Yeah. I'm a jump in here because I can't, Eric really encapsulate all the nutritional aspects of it, but I'm gonna give you a slightly different perspective on the antidote to slave food and to the slave food project, which, remember, it's a totality of stress, of discrimination and nutritional stress. And so when we look at the core component of what is the antidote to stress is love. It's love. It's real love. And where that begins, love is an action word. And so I'm going to tell you, break it down hormonally, is that what ends up happening is a degree of oxytocin is released. So we speak about the stress hormone cascade. And what ends up happening of the constriction of the vessels and the heart racing and the ill effects of creating a diabetic state and hypertensive state and insomnia and so forth. But the love hormone is different. Instead of fight or flight, it's tend and befriend. It's love and concern. That all of a sudden now the vessels begin to dilate, the heart begins a reparative and restorative fashion. That happens when we begin to embrace love instead of hate, instead of demise. And so as a result of love, which becomes an action, we begin to embrace forgiveness. And studies have shown that when you forgive, that you actually have improved health outcomes for your heart. Wow. That when you begin to exhibit gratitude, become gracious, then all of a sudden we see that chronic disease begins to dissipate. So there's power inside this action item of a thing called love. That when we begin to love our creator, that what ends up happening is studies have shown that people who are more inclined to go to church are more inclined to have less addictive behaviors. That people who go to church, women who go to church, have better and improved cardiovascular outcomes compared to those who don't. There is power that's there, that those who engage in prayer and meditation, prayer is speaking, meditation is listening, that all of a sudden there's less cardiovascular outcomes reduced. And so we have to begin the process as we strengthen, when we embrace love and the spiritual aspect of prayer and meditation, we strengthen our prefrontal cortex, the area that reasons. And Eric breaks that down beautifully in sermons as well, about the aspect of how it strengthens our mind, that now we're reasoning and we're able to make that connection towards what our goal is. Because the question you have to ask yourself is, so you're healthy, now what? Now what? What now?
Yeah.
What's the goal? What's your purpose? You're getting healthy for what purpose? To keep living the way you were living? Or you're getting healthy for a particular purpose for God's plan? That's what we have to ask ourselves. And so it's connected. It's connected in terms of full circle.
Wow.
Let me jump in here and say that just tag team on that. We talked about Romans chapter 7. The other chapter 7 I love is Revelation chapter 7. It talks about the seal of the living God that is placed in the forehead, and that the four angels should not allow the air wind to touch the earth or the sea until the servants of God have been sealed in their forehead. Being sealed in the forehead is the point of the health message. It takes clarity. In going back to Matthew chapter 24, when the disciples say, Lord, when shall these things, and when shall be the end of the world? He says, do not be planeo in the Greek, planeo, which means do not be deceived. Do not be led away. In order to not be deceived, and the way that the Greek puts that, is to have a clarity of mind and not be that one sheep that left the 99. Our health message helps us to have a clarity that helps us to not be deceived. I also believe Sabbath keeping helps us not be deceived. There's a protective power in that, but the health message clearly does. And that's why it's such an important thing that we do this. It's not just about being healthy. It's about having the clarity of mind to be saved and to be sanctified. And then to be a vessel. E.E. Cleveland had a great line in one of his sermons when I was at Oakwood. He said, "I'm not a vegetarian so that I can live forever. He said, I'm a vegetarian so I can live as long as possible to tell you Negroes this good news." Right? He said, I will live the way God says live so I can live as long as I possibly can preaching this gospel. That's why he said, I'm going to be healthy. He said, being healthy doesn't save me. Eating the right diet isn't going to get me into heaven all by itself. But he said, but it allows me to spread this great gospel. So purpose matters. And I want to go back to one of the things Dr. Baptiste said about forgiveness. It's one of my things. I have a whole sermon on. I just did in Fort Pierce back in December, the sermon on forgiveness. What we learned is that one of the strongest mitigators of the consequences of stress is to forgive those who have harmed you. In fact, it's even when you looked at the studies around Black women, it was even more evident. You ruminate the traumas and what people have done you, ruminate it over and over and over again. And with each time it passes through your conscious mind, the damage is done all over again. Wow. Forgiveness frees you from that process, buffers you from the consequences of the traumatic experiences you've had. And let me just say this plainly, as painful as this is to say to Black people, this is one of the reasons why we even have to forgive those who have oppressed us and done us wrong. Because as Dr. King said, if you don't send, he didn't say it like this, I'll say it like this, but Dr. King said this in essence, you don't send up the blood pressure of the person you hate. Hating that person sends up your own blood pressure.
Mercy.
Right? Wow. Forgiving that person frees you. It liberates you. And that's one of the reasons why it's really critically important that we teach forgiveness. And here's the kicker. Forgive yourself as well. A lot of us live our lives beating ourselves up on our past mistakes. That is the work of the accuser. And the accuser wants you stressed out and worried about your past. And as we all preach and say, when the devil reminds you of your past, remind him of his future.
Come on now. Good stuff. Good stuff. Listen, we're going to ask our host to sit tight. We're going to be right back. We're going to take a little break for just about a minute here. And because there's a couple of things that we want to talk to you about. Mercy, if you are just joining us today, you've joined us for our second part of the Slave Food Project. We've talked about it about a year ago when our guest, Dr. Columbus Baptiste and Dr. Eric Walsh, have joined us again here at the Pastors Roundtable. Pastor Wade, talk to us. There's a couple other things we want people to know. What are those things we want them to know about today?
Listen, I've been liberated today. Liberation nutrition. I love it. I love it. Every time I sit at the feet of these two doctors, I learned something, and I'm going to start walking in my new liberation. If you have been blessed by what you've heard today, please share it with those that are far and wide in your network. Like us on Facebook and YouTube so that you can gain more information. Matter of fact, some of the information that's being shared today will be in the show notes that you can go back to the PRT website, and you'll gain some more information, contact information, things like that on what you've heard today. I'm just mind blown by what I'm hearing today.
Yeah, powerful stuff. And listen, if you are just joining us again, and if you have not subscribed to the Pastors Roundtable YouTube channel, we want to invite you to do that. Right over there, you can click that subscribe button. If you know that there are more people that you want to see this and you don't know how to share, you don't know how to send it, if you just hit the thumbs up button on any platform that you're watching on now, then that helps those platforms put this video, put this conversation in front of more people. So you hit that thumbs up. Any kind of a reaction that you give, even if it's a frown, it makes more people be able to join this conversation. So we want you to do that. We're trying to get to 1,000 subscriptions on the YouTube channel. I think right now, Pastor Wade, we are just under 800. So we want to make sure that we give you that invitation to go ahead and to subscribe to that YouTube channel.
We want you to also go to our webpage and sign up for our newsletter. We're just putting the finishing touches on our first edition of our newsletter. That should go out very soon. You want to make sure you get in that on that list so you can receive it. And if you are enjoying Pastors Roundtable and you would like us to continue bringing this kind of information and opportunity and resources, we need your support. Someone says salvation is free, but ministry costs. This is a ministry to us. Please just support us. Go to our webpage and you can hit the support page and support Pastors Roundtable. Whatever you can do. Maybe you can make it a monthly gift that you do something monthly. It doesn't have to be a lot. Just anything you can do to help make Pastors Roundtable more relevant and resource to help you as we partner for ministry here.
All right, you've still got time to share this feed. If you have not shared it to your stream, to your feed, if you have not invited somebody, you've got just a little bit of time left as we rejoin our guests now, Dr. Columbus Baptiste and Dr. Eric Walsh. What a wonderful time we've had so far. Gentlemen, I'd like to review. I see a question that did come in about diabetes. I'm seeing Colleen put that in here there, and I did save that one to come back to it. I'm going to try to pronounce that name. Maisha. Okay, I shouldn't have tried. But how is diabetes hereditary when it's based on what you're eating that causes you to get diabetes? Aren't you in control of that? I don't remember exactly what I was referencing at the time, but that is the question. I'll put it back one more time just so that we can make sure that we get all of it there. And anybody want to take a stab at that one?
You can go first there, Columbus.
Yeah, I was just finishing up reading it. So I think one of the key things to understand about diabetes is the fact that there are more than one type of there's more than one type of diabetes. Now, what we're seeing as a health community and as a nation is we're seeing that diabetes seems to be infringing. So when I came up and trained, there was something called adult onset diabetes and juvenile onset diabetes, or type 1, that seemed to be more genetically mediated, where there was a loss of the ability for your pancreas to produce insulin. But now we no longer call it adult and juvenile onset, because what we're seeing adult or lifestyle mediated tends to occur younger and younger inside of our adolescents and inside of our kids. And we're seeing there is a preponderance of diabetics who are insulin resistant, which means that there is really a manifestation of lifestyle obesity, resistance from intracellular lipids or fats, which is the basically gumming up your keyholes of where basically the mechanism in which your body takes up nutrients to store. And when it's no longer able to do that, it persists inside your blood vessels in the form of sugar or glucose and leads to damage. So there are multiple types of diabetes, but many of the type 1 diabetics, because of their eating practice, end up also developing insulin resistance as well, long term. And so there is still a role for your nutrition. There is still a role for your exercise. There is still a role for your sleep, all of which can profoundly impact the rates of diabetes inside your life and for your loved ones as well. I give every patient a cheat code. The cheat code is, after you eat, walk 10 minutes. And that alone is going to help your metabolism of blood sugar and can help the control of your diabetes.
Wow.
Yeah, good stuff.
And I would, when you talking about diabetes, we know that, as we just said, one of the key reasons we get diabetes is fat consumption. It's fat, and specifically animal fat, clogs the insulin receptor site, right? But so does sugar. Sugar causes the liver to make fatty acids that can also do it. So when you eat a high-fat, high-sugar diet, we talked about earlier, that makes you feel good, it literally is the perfect way to get diabetes. The other thing I wanted to throw out there, though, is that the type 1 diabetes, the juvenile, we think is purely genetic. But the studies show that you actually get increased risk of developing type 1 diabetes if you're, as a child, consume cow's milk. So cow's milk, because there's some way that there's something antigenic in the cow's milk that may trigger your own body to attack your pancreas and destroy your beta islet cells. So removing cow's milk from a child's diet probably decreases the risk of developing type 1 diabetes.
Wow.
Wow. So I'm seeing some activity here in our chat, and I don't think we have that as part of our questions, but we may need to touch it. You tapped into the concept of processed foods, but as Adventists in particular, but as people vegetarians, we are known for plant-based meat substitutes. And you tapped on it before with the high increase in sodium and the low increase of fiber that is necessary, that's good for the body. But what would you how would you talk about the value of the new plant-based meat substitutes, such as Impossible Burgers and Beyond Meat, and Kentucky Fried Chicken has now jumped into that arena with its
that's
nuggets,
right. Sure
and
have.
everybody is just going crazy over
Mercy.
that. What help us to kind of put that in perspective? That new plant-based meat substitute.
Yeah, and that a number of people have mentioned it, but that last question, as you can see, was coming from our university president, Dr. Leslie Pollard.
Yeah, and let me give a shout out to Dr. Pollard, a mentor of mine and a good friend, and I love what he's been doing with the institution. So blessings to him. He asks an amazingly appropriate question, and most of us as Adventists, even if you ate meat growing up, you still ate a lot of veggie meat because you go to lunch at church and they make and back then they'd break it out of cans and stuff that we don't buy veggie meat in a can. At least I don't see it much anymore.
Let me stop.
There's a few problems with the meat substitutes. The first, and probably the one that has probably caused the most damage, well, the two things that have probably caused the most damage historically is the salt content. The sodium content in these products is actually astronomical. I had a friend, very fit, very muscular, very lean, had a stroke. And when he did his research and looked at it, he's in the healthcare profession, he found that it was the salt intake. This was someone who go out and run miles. He lifts a lot of weights. It was the salt content. And once he backed his way into it, he realized it was the fact that he ate the veggie meat products 2 and 3 times a day, as part of his regular day. So that's the first thing. We mentioned earlier as well, some of the soy protein isolates that sometimes can actually act like the animal proteins that kind of work as cancer promoters because it's so concentrated and so processed. So obviously edamame, the soybeans themselves are very healthy. They do not cause breast cancer. The tofu, tempeh, all those are very good foods, minimally processed. But once it's hyper processed, it changes things. Now, in defense of the newer meats, there was a study done through UCSF, I think it was, where they compared some of the newer meats to real meat, and they put people on it and looked at cardiovascular outcomes. According to the study, they basically said that you did have better cardiac outcomes from the meat substitutes than the other ones. My advice to people is probably on Sabbath afternoon is probably going to be pretty hard to get away from some of these things. So if you're going to make an exception, that's probably the day to do it. But the rest of the week, it's better to eat whole food. Pots of lentils and brown rice and quinoa. Make your own black bean burgers. That type of thing. The tough thing about this message is it takes time. So you've got to learn how to manage as part of the whole liberation nutrition. And Dr. Baptiste is actually excellent at explaining this kind of stuff. How do we actually put these things into practice to save our lives? And it takes dedication, but it goes back to what we said earlier. I mean, you have to feel worthwhile in a society that may have made most of us not feel so worthwhile most of our lives. And so you've got to value yourself in order to do this.
Wow. Absolutely. I'll chime in briefly as it relates to these burgers, and thank you, Dr. Pollard, for the question. Like Eric, I appreciate your mentorship years ago and so forth as well. I participated inside of an article through Journal of American College of Cardiology, where what we were doing is we were working on putting together an update on plant-based nutrition. And one of the things, like Eric mentioned, in terms of there was a unique article that was done comparing those two components and showing that markers of inflammation were reduced in individuals who consumed the plant-based burgers. Now, here's the thing. You have to ask yourself, what's your why? What's your question are you really asking? If your question is this beneficial to my health? Is this action going to help reduce my burden of disease in the future? That's really if that's your question, where are you comparing it to? So is the Beyond Burger or whatever it is it better than red meat? Absolutely. Is it better than red beans and rice? Black beans, curry, lentils? No, absolutely not. So you have
Wow.
to ask yourself where you're at. And you have to also think in terms of when I'm taking care of patients in the hospital, and these patients may be smokers, they may be dependent on nicotine, they may be addicted to nicotine. You know what we do in the hospital? We'll give them a nicotine patch. That nicotine patch doesn't mean that it's healthy for them. It's to kind of help them make that bridge and that transition towards smoking to not smoking. So in many
Yeah.
instances, these meats really serve the function of transitioning for many individuals who are skeptical. They're not quite ready on that journey of health, that marathon of health, as Eric mentioned. They're not quite ready that this may be a transition. I've coached a lot of people inside my career. And I'll never forget, I was down in New Orleans. I had the honor of being down there in New Orleans to speak about this very topic. And I remember the Uber driver. We had given him a flyer with my information on it. And he happened to pick us up and he said, "Oh, I checked you out, Doc. I checked you out. I don't want to hear anything you guys say." I
Wow.
was like, "Come on, you gonna treat me like that?" He's like, "I don't want to hear one thing." An hour later, I'm debating, I'm giving him everything. I'm throwing the kitchen sink at him, trying to get him convinced to go whole food plant-based. All I could get that man to do was to try one of these fake burgers. He said, "Okay, Doc, I'll try it. I'll tell you." That was one of my greatest accomplishments because I believe that that may be the door to open up for that individual,
That's
that
right.
the other components of what I plan to see. And now someone else comes behind me that maybe he stops by a church down there in New Orleans. Maybe he stops by a church where they're serving health promoting foods. And all of a sudden now it's like the bells start to go off. So there is a role for these things, but we have to ask ourselves if our goal is truly health,
Mhm.
then every action that we do every day has to be geared towards that.
All right. Sounds good. So listen, how can we be more mindful, and what are some of the steps that we can take to ensure? So earlier on, when we first started the show today, somebody used the word users in reference to food, and whenever there's a user, there's a pusher. So this question is saying, how can we ensure that we do not become pushers of slave food, and what part of our consumptive spending power, or what part does or can our consumer spending power play in this? And that's again a kind of a loaded question here at the tail end of our program today. But how do we avoid becoming pushers, and what part can our consumer spending power play? And we talked about the weaponization of food, the racial part of this, or the potential racial part of this. Is there something that as a community that we can do with our dollars that make a difference in this scenario that we're looking at?
Yeah, I'll jump in and start off. I think if for many of us who are of the Adventist faith and grew up being vegetarian, we remember the days when the only milks were the ones that you got from a powder bag. We remember
Yeah,
that at the grocery
soya
store,
chunk.
there weren't any of these options that were available unless you went to the old-fashioned Adventist book center that was there in order to get some veggie meats and everything else like that. But guess why there's a shift? Because once again, the dollars dictate that all of a sudden these items become available, that there is an area, there's an arena for it. And so our dollars do have power. And collectively throughout the eons of time, it's been demonstrated. Just like our voting rights, our votes count when we're allowed to vote. Different subject, different day. But when we're investing our dollars in the right place, it will determine and shift. It can play a role in shifting things. But I think even different than that, on an individual basis, whether or not I'm at church or going to someone's house for a potluck, once this quarantine and these restrictions begin to disseminate to relinquish, that we can't really have this pressure that we put on people. A little bit won't hurt you. Come on, you losing too much weight. Come on, you can have a little bit.
Right.
It's Sabbath afternoon. Come on, celebrate with us. It's your birthday. We put all these pressures
Hmm.
that trigger memories of engagement. And so now it's harder for individuals to kind of maintain that fashion. And so I think we have to be a community of support, of resiliency. Eric brought up the idea of, I believe he brought up the idea of epigenetics, which is the ability of the body to, that your DNA is not your destiny. that your DNA actually has these light switches, these dials that turn up and turn down disease. And so one of the things that we know is that lifestyle and food also predicts it. But here's the thing: community resiliency predicts it. That when we look at the ability of the community to be supportive, it can really be protective. And so not only from a standpoint of direct influence, but in terms of direct health outcomes. And so that's why what you mentioned is so important in terms of community support, resiliency, and really using our dollars in that fashion.
Good. Mm. Eric, anything to add to that?
Yeah, what I was, I used to be one who thought, try and manage and control things. But as I studied addiction medicine at Loma Linda University when I was in residency there, I realized you can't tell a crack addict to just have a little bit of crack. Wow. You can't even tell a nicotine cigarette smoker just have a little bit of cigarettes. And food works the same way. We know that in cheese. I keep going back to cheese. There are casomorphones that are that are related to opiates like morphine and heroin in cheese. Very low dose, but it's part of the reason why cheese is so hard to give up. So some things you actually do need to just let go of. Like you can't. There's no moderation. If you try and moderate, with an addictive substance, and some of these foods, again, the food industry has food chemists and engineers who've designed the food so that when you start eating it, you can't stop eating it. And they tell you that again. Once you pop, you can't stop. They tell you that. So when you talk about mindfulness, you really do have to be cognizant of what you eat. One of the things I tell people, I don't know if I have one laying around here, but I tell them to take index cards, because I do this for myself. Take the index cards and you write on one side of the index card, on one side you write the reason you want to make this lifestyle change. And on the other side, you write a Bible verse that gives you the motivation to make the change. So you might write, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Have this mind in you that was also in Christ Jesus. Love not the world, neither the things that are in this world. There's a lot of them you could write. And when you write on one side, I want to be alive to see my child graduate from college. And you write on the other side a Bible verse that is a promise. Before you eat, to be mindful, you pull out the card and you read the two sides of it. All of a sudden, it changes the way you eat. You won't mindlessly eat anymore. And here's the power. When Christ was challenged on the issue of appetite, he used the word of God. He did not fight in his willpower and his strength. He said, it is written, man should not live by bread alone. And so this is the power that comes from incorporating God's word as a sword to fight against the enemy when he attacks. And he will attack. That's just the reality of what happens. On the other issue of spending power and so forth, it would be a beautiful thing if Black America rose up together and said, we're not buying any more fast food. We're not buying any more junk food.
Wow.
Because then all of a sudden they would put different things in our neighborhoods. Magic Johnson, I have a lot of respect for Magic Johnson, especially obviously as a basketball player, but even more so as a financial person. Because Magic Johnson said, you know what? Movie theaters and Starbucks and gyms can survive in our neighborhoods. What a lot of these grocery stores have said is, we're not in these neighborhoods because we wouldn't make any money. The risk of theft is too high. That's literally what they said. I worked in the health department in Los Angeles County, and literally this is what they would say why they couldn't bring grocery stores in. But Magic brought in businesses, and I'm not saying that we support Starbucks or movie theaters, but he brought in movie theaters, Starbucks, grocery stores, and gyms that thrived in the very neighborhoods everyone said it could never thrive in, which means that our economic power, even in these places, is still tangible and real, which means that we collectively can vote with our dollar, vote out the poison pushers, and bring in people who would give us better options.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Pastor Wade, I think it's worthwhile to also give a shout out to Dr. Pollard and Oakwood University and Oakwood Farms and that mobile truck that they put dollars to. They put money into saying we're going to take good food into food swamps and into, in order to make sure that there are options, and they're educating and the place that they built there on campus to help educate and provide care for the community. So, and these are Black people.
Yeah.
This is us, working for people, and not just in the Black community, but anybody, to be able to make that. And so that's a very tangible way that we can see that people are putting money and using the consumer spending power to make a difference in these areas.
And I think we need to really identify the fact when Dr. Pollard shared about the food desert right there in northern Alabama, right there in Huntsville, right in the northern part of Huntsville, right where the school is. You wonder, there's so many options of food, there's so many things there, and yet still it is a food desert. Sometimes we just need to recognize what is right before us so that we can be mobilized to do something. Our time has gone, Pastor Paul, but before we let our guests go, we would like them to share a little bit about how we can help the Slave Food Project. Just when you go to their website, when you go to the website, guys, and you look at the imagery and you see what's happening, how can we help you? How can we be a part of what you're doing to support what you're doing? I'm excited about it. What can you tell us that we can do to join in behind you?
I'll jump in then first. So I think just very similar fashion to what you all mentioned, be supportive. I think our broadcast that we produce on YouTube, Slave Food Project, follow us, like us, share it. That's there. I think the words of encouragement are so powerful. The pastor's wife gave me a word of encouragement. That was very powerful. It's helpful in terms of knowing that folks out there are listening and that it's resonating with them as we seek to do God's work. We want to deliver this message through whatever media will have us and are available, through written word, through books, through potentially documentaries, which is still our ultimate goal. And so we're working to that end. Thank you.
Okay. All right.
I would only add this. We would ask that the saints of God continue to lift us in prayer. The Bible says that the effectual, fervent prayers of a righteous man availeth much. So keep the ministry in prayer. And we just ask that God would direct us to what he would have us to do.
Good. Well, absolutely. Well, we will continue to do that, lifting you both and your ministry up in prayer. We appreciate and salute you for what you were doing and the contribution you are continuing to make. And just before I go, I want to highlight this comment, because we have had another very highly acclaimed and sought after health guru in our chat today, and that is none other than Miss Donna Green Goodman.
Yes.
She is in the chat today. I know most of our audience is probably very familiar with her and her work, and so we are honored and privileged to have her in this chat today. But I wanted to bring up this point that she brings up, which, by the way, gentlemen, I came across first because my wife told me she heard it on Slave Food Project, and that African Americans are the largest growing demographic, or largest demographic moving to a plant-powered diet. There's a lot of opportunity there. That the fastest growing segment of the plant-based population is African Americans here in the United States. So work is paying off. The effort and the time that you guys are putting into this, and that so many others are, it is making a difference. And so we want to encourage you to keep on doing what you're doing. Don't ever get discouraged or think that sometimes it's church folk that are the ones who fight the biblically based health message more than other folk. But there are people who are willing, people who are hearing this and embracing this. I wish we had time to spend some time on that point. But again, we have enjoyed and appreciated so much your presence and your contribution to this conversation today. Thank you so very much.
Well, again, thank you for joining us. Thank you to our viewers for joining us today here at the Pastors Roundtable. We do miss our co-host, Dr. Henry. On behalf of Dr. Henry, Pastor Paul, and myself, thank you again, Dr. Baptiste and Dr. Walsh, for joining us again. And we look forward to hearing more about what the Slave Food Project is doing, and any way we could help you here at the Pastors Roundtable, please feel free to reach out to us. And to our viewers, thank you for joining us. We look forward to seeing you on next week as we continue to partner together to make ministry relevant,
resourced,
and real.
Take care, everybody.